Okay. And I need to share screen.
Oh, give me 1 second. Okay, you should be good to go. Good morning, students. We're very glad to have you in our session on peace building in the time of forever wars. And I'm turning it over to Randy Thompson to give our opening announcement.
Well, we'd like to welcome you guys to our 2021 Youth Security Forum. Virtual. We're really glad we were able to get this organized with the school district this year. So it's great to be able to do this virtually and then record it for prosperity. Joining us today is actually the sponsor of today's panel, Ted Morse. But as you see by our slide, we've got the Chamber of Commerce, the MSTS, which runs the Nevada National Security Site, Larry Struve, and the Zymex are our sponsors of our program this year. And since you just mentioned We the People, Maureen, the legislature, which I'm a lobbyist, just 2 nights ago approved $1 million for the state's We the People program because we're flush with cash this year, which is an odd thing. But it was really cool to see that the legislature is supporting this program. So I think that was a good way to start off, that they've got some good money coming into the program. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Randy. I really appreciate it. And welcome, Karen Decker. We are thrilled to have you here and very pleased that you were able to give us some insight and share some of your phenomenal experience in understanding the situation in Afghanistan and peace building. We're also very pleased to have Megan Chalabowski with us. I probably screwed up your name, but I'm sorry, who's also from the U.S. Institute of Peace. And Megan will be giving some insight into programs for students at USIP throughout this discussion today. So with that, Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you, and please start with your perception that we were talking about just before we started the recording.
Okay. Great, Maureen. Thank you very much. And thanks to the Chamber of Commerce and the other organizations and individuals who put events like this together, make them happen, allow them to happen, because you can't do really anything in the world without bringing groups of people together. And the best and most successful endeavors, at least in my experience, have been public-private partnerships, where the private sector and the government sector work together and amplify each other's strengths and fill in for each other's weaknesses. I will not be somebody who says that the government can do it all or should do it all by itself. And to circle back around to the thought I had at the beginning, when I was in Kabul, when the COVID pandemic, sort of exploded around the world, and we were looking at, how best to support the COVID effort in Afghanistan, even as we were watching America struggle to contain the outbreak and handle it, and across the world, countries were having difficulties because we just didn't know what we were dealing with. And as time went by, the first sort of 6 months of the pandemic, it really kind of occurred to me that in Afghanistan, we saw really weak institutions, right? The Ministry of Public Health that ran clinics and hospitals was completely overwhelmed. Destructively so. And the government had no messaging campaign. And so institutions were incredibly weak, but Afghans themselves were incredibly resilient. They just sort of, they've had 40 years of nothing but trouble. So it isn't like hardship is unknown to them. And I think they kind of dug down and they got through it and dealt with the pandemic with the resources they had, and there was no politics to the response in Afghanistan. Whereas in the United States, it seemed to be the opposite, where we had very strong institutions that were stressed almost to the breaking point. but we didn't have, it didn't seem to me, looking at the United States from overseas, we didn't seem to have as much resilience in some of our population. And you saw then, mass, free discussions about freedoms when it came to mask wearing, or the other issues related to the pandemic. And I just thought that was an interesting way to look at it. In the United States, strong institutions, low resilience. Afghanistan, high resilience, weak institutions. And I think it helped us try and figure out where to plug in terms of what the US was able to do with Afghanistan in the early days of the pandemic.
Karen, I will pull the thread on that point and say I work with the Native communities, and they were more like Afghanistan. They had very weak institutions and phenomenal resilience, and now are leading the nation in the vaccine efforts. So it's an interesting comparison even within the country.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was a great introduction, and it really brings us, ties the situation in Afghanistan to the present time. So before we open it up to the students, and I'll ask you both students to be thinking about questions for our speaker, but so as you look back, Karen, as you examine the situation that we are, and you're thinking, and you put in your thinking cap that we're talking to students who were born after the war in Afghanistan started, and they're now headed off to college at the point where we're wrapping things down. How do you envision their role in the world as they go out and they have to contend with this, because it's part of us, the US, and how do you put it in perspective for people who are trying to grapple about a war ending that started before they were born?
Yeah, it is. So my first thought when I listen to folks talk about the forever war of Afghanistan for Americans, the first thing I usually think of is, well, the forever war for Americans is 20 years. The war for Afghanistan has been going on since 1979. So it's not, we have, generations in Afghanistan that have known nothing but conflict since the Soviets invaded in 79. So they're even more uncertain about how they carve a new way of living as the peace talks progress, and hopefully, inshallah, as we say, there will be a peace agreement that is reached in the future, and that both American young people and young people in Afghanistan are able to really look at new opportunities. But I think in terms of what the upcoming generation of Americans can do, I think there's such a huge range of opportunities for people-to-people connections. And part of that comes about as a result of political polarization kind of globally, right? Whether you're talking about European governments, whether you're talking about governments in South Asia or here at home, there are extreme ends to the political spectrum. And that, I think, will impact young people in the United States, because it allows for the scourge of terrorism to continue. It just metastasizes and takes different forms. And we're dealing with that a little bit now, looking beyond conflicts like the Taliban in Afghanistan to the more transnational groups like ISIS, who recruit in universities primarily. And so I think there is, for these students going into university, for university students and then young professionals, there is such a range of opportunity for people in school to connect to one another, and try and make some sense out of what is an increasingly polemical discussion among the older generation. Young people, I think, can be less, don't necessarily have to occupy the fringe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It does show that peacekeeping can go on in multiple different levels. Sometimes it's communication among students, sometimes it's high-level diplomatic relations, sometimes it's, you know, public health officials reaching out and supporting each other. So that's an important point.
Yeah, I think there's an aspect to peace building that is preventative. Like, let's not have the war to begin with, or let's not have the terrorist incident to begin with. And you do that by avoiding the circumstances that allow a group to plot an attack or allow a war to break out. And again, the more people are talking to one another, finding common ground, working on common projects, for instance, climate change, I think the less likely you are, and I'd be interested in Megan's views on this from the USIP perspective, the less likely people are to go to war with one another if they're working on a common set of problems. They may not agree, and I suppose that would be a vulnerability to look out for, that there is a common problem, but people have very different ways of looking at it. But I think that universities, colleges are great opportunities to start talking about the issues that should be uniting all of us.
That's a great perspective. That is a great perspective. Megan, do you want to add to that before we open it up to the students for questions?
Nothing other than I love that idea. And I know that in our work, there's a lot of things on our website about different university groups. There are peace clubs at universities in Afghanistan that we've been working with as an institute. And so those who are interested in this should go online and find some of these articles, because to hear about what students at universities in Afghanistan are doing is so interesting, and it's a story you never get to hear. And then to think about these connections that can be made student to student is a really great idea. And I'm sure is something that would interest a lot of students watching this and would make a big difference. So I love that idea.
Excellent. Thank you, Megan. So Varun and Jason, I'm going to open it up to you if you have specific questions.
So you mentioned that one of the reasons that like we're still at war with Afghanistan and like kind of like a forever war is due to like difficulty in the institutions. Can you I guess clarify a bit more of what those like difficulties are?
Well, sure. I mean, sort of across the board, the government in Afghanistan is weak. So I'll back up for a minute. In '79, the Soviets invaded, established a communist regime that ultimately was overthrown by factions that arose out of the jihadi groups that fought the Soviets. And so when the Soviets started to withdraw, which would have been about 1989, 1990, there was a period in Afghanistan where you had civil war. And out of the civil war grew the Taliban. And the Taliban were in the mid-90s a highly rigidly conservative group of individuals who saw, I think, who were offended by the excesses they were seeing among warlords in the early part of the 90s. And they wanted to, they put in place a brutal regime that took basic human rights away from everyone, but also stopped the predations of the warlords. but because of the isolation that happened as a result of the Taliban preventing people from exercising their human rights, so the Taliban did not give anybody any freedoms. They were isolated internationally as a result. So they got help where they could, and one of the groups that helped them was Al-Qaeda. So the Taliban in and of itself created an ecosystem that allowed groups like Al-Qaeda to operate, that resulted in 9/11, that brought us to Afghanistan. So sort of running through that, I think, is helpful again to underscore the point that when the United States began to look at trying to build a relationship with a government in Afghanistan that would prevent groups from Al-Qaeda from operating, they need to have some functionality, and there was none. It had either been destroyed in the Civil War or it had been destroyed by the Taliban, and then we had come along and whatever was left was dismantled. So we were starting from ground zero in terms of building up the capacity of Afghans to govern themselves. Everything from providing education to children, to providing for healthcare, to creating economic opportunities so that people could earn a living. All of those functions in the early part of the 2000s after 9/11 were had to be restarted, and it takes a long time to grow a government. And I think it's a real weakness. I think Ted Morse was talking briefly about his experiences and just how long it takes to do some of these things. And that's something that, Americans generally, one of the hardest things in diplomacy is the 24-hour news cycle and the fact that we want things to happen immediately, right? And it doesn't work that way. Just take education as an example. How long does it take you to get an education? Well, 12 to 16 years, and you end up with an undergraduate degree. So it's not realistic to go into a place like Afghanistan, which has nothing, and want to see real change and a new generation emerge when they haven't been educated to do that. So education is a huge part of the problem about why the government remains weak, because we are only just now beginning to see the Afghans emerge who have had the benefit of an education, be that in Afghanistan or somewhere abroad. So that means if you don't have an education, you don't have very many doctors and lawyers and people who can work, civil servants who can manage the process of the government, have a Ministry of Finance, collect taxes, pay for infrastructure. All of these things were being done by internationals because there was nothing that existed that was really usable. So with weakness in government, there will always be people who prey on those weaknesses. And sometimes that looks like Taliban trying to reassert influence. And that of course has happened, but it also comes in the form of corruption. And with huge amounts of international money comes huge opportunities for that money to be diverted. You're trying to get things done quickly. You don't know the culture very well. You don't know the relationships very well, and you make mistakes. And the United States made mistakes. Other countries made mistakes. There has been plenty of opportunity to make mistakes in Afghanistan.
For many generations.
Yeah. I mean, I would be the last person to say we created corruption in Afghanistan. It has existed there in some form or fashion forever, as it does everywhere else. I'm not picking on Afghanistan, but we certainly poured so much money into the country that we raised the stakes, I think.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we've got, so that's not to say that that the situation is hopeless, right? It does require patience. And that means that, sort of my generation of peacemaker, my generation of peace builders is going to have to pass the project on to the next generation of peace builders. And that's appropriate. It can take generations to achieve real change.
That is exceedingly helpful. Ted, you are welcome to ask a question, except you are on mute. Ted, you need to unmute. There you go.
I wanted to respond to Varun in terms of what is meant when Karen talks about weak institution. And Karen, yours was a wonderful, wonderful one. But from a student's point of view, institutions are not just the government. Institutions are the strength of the student associations, the strength of religious organization, the strength of the media, the strength that comes in institutions for problem solving. In Afghanistan, which I've known since I was evacuated there in the India-Pakistan War of 1971, those institutions have not evolved for domestic local problem solving. And you can't leave it just to the government and the political parties. The institutions are everything that I just went through, and I wanted to point that out to you, Varun.
Thank you.
That's great, Ted. Thank you for that insight, because I think we tend to think of institutions in our perspective, which are government entities and agencies. Which brings me to another question for you, Karen, which is, what is the government structure there? So you have students of government here with us. We're accustomed to, we have a federal government, we have state entities, we have local jurisdictions. There is some, there's some tension between those, but there's a hierarchy. What is, when we talk about the governments in Afghanistan, what are we talking about?
Yeah. So it looks a lot like ours, with less power devolved to the state level, which is actually a topic of great interest and controversy among Afghans who think maybe there should be more power devolved to the provinces. So essentially there are 31 provinces that make up Afghanistan, which has a strong executive branch and an upper house and a lower house in parliament, and a separate Supreme Court. So all of the institutions that we are familiar with. And, not unlike many places in the world, there are constituencies devoted to each one of the branches of government with their own agendas and their own leaders. But largely, the situation now in Afghanistan is everything flows from the executive branch in Kabul. So the president and his cabinet of ministers, who are just like our secretaries of our departments, have budgets that come out of a central budget, and they pass down to the provinces funds for projects that are required in different parts of Afghanistan. It is a very diverse population in the country, and diverse in terms of what it needs from north to south. North has a lot of water because of the mountains and the snowmelt. South is desert and dry. There are a Sunni majority, but also a sizable Shia community, plus an Uzbek contingent in the north. All of these factors sort of combine together for competition of government resources. And one of the things that I found, because I spent almost 6 years in the country at various times from 2005 to now, and I spent primarily most of my time in the provinces. So I was down in the south in Kandahar, and I was in the east for another 2-year period. And we had these teams that the PRTs that I think I mentioned in my video speech, that worked closely with provincial governments, which you would equate to state governments, just on probably a smaller scale. And we worked extremely closely with them to build up their capacity, to build roads, to build clinics, to educate children, all of the services that a citizen would expect from its government. And the deal was that our colleagues in Kabul, who were based in Kabul, were working the same sort of capacity building with the ministries and the central government and they'd meet in the middle. So you'd have capacity at the provincial level and you'd have capacity at the national level, and then everything was going to work well. And we were a little ambitious, I think, very ambitious, I think, in terms of what we thought, how much information, how much resources that Afghans would be able to absorb and turn around and turn into governance. But a government structure that is very familiar, I think, to all of us here.
That's great. That's really helpful, because we hear a lot about the warlords and the provinces and various things, and so it's not always clear that there is a structure there that we can work with. So we have a question that's have we seen the end of full-scale declared wars, or is it possible that we are just in a small window of time where peace is possible?
For Afghanistan specifically, or more broadly? For Afghanistan specifically,
Start with that.
I think you're not going to see armies marching across Afghanistan, and they're in the course of the peace process is, I think, established. It's not producing peace at the moment, but it don't discount the importance of having an agreed forum where members of the Taliban and members of the government and non-governmental representations, to go back to the very good point that there's more than one kind of institution that is important. The Afghan delegation is not solely government representatives. It includes non-governmental actors, religious leaders as well. But because the peace process, I think, is they have agreed on what the forum will be. I think we are going to move beyond the war of army against army. I think it will take time for the violence to stop, because for the Taliban, that is the only currency they have, the ability to produce violence. And that, so if you're a negotiator for the Taliban, that's the last thing you're going to give up, because it's the thing the other side wants the most. So that's my thought on the Afghanistan piece. On more broadly, I think too, we are not going to see big land wars fought among armies. And oh my God, I hope that we never again see large land wars fought among nations. But that's not to say that we can't kill a lot of people still. We just have technology that allows us to produce horrific suffering through ways other than, sacking a great city.
Yeah, that's really great insight, because very often, and as we've seen, and as this generation has seen, it's really easy to get into a war. Mm-hmm. It's a whole lot harder to get into the peace. And so the peace that's possible may mean cessation of violence for some period of time, but it can be long-standing standoffs, as it were. So
Yeah.
that's really important. So Vernon, Jason, please feel free to inject other questions if you have them. You can put them in the chat or raise your hand. I'm going to ask you a little bit more, Karen, about the role of certain things in that we're dealing with in Afghanistan that do have a direct connection to us. Two factors. One is the issue of natural resources and how that plays in government stability or instability, and of course the role of poppies and drugs in the country and how that plays in what is happening now and what may happen in the future.
Yeah. So really good question, because it's vital to the future of the country. It has, Afghanistan is surprisingly rich in natural resources. It's never a country that anyone thinks of as having a wealth of resources, but it was, prior to the Soviet invasion, it was the breadbasket of South Asia. And when you think about India with its billion people, the markets are huge. And agriculture, Afghanistan, I think, exported dried fruits and nuts around the world, but particularly to India, which still values the brand of dried fruits and nuts from Afghanistan are the best, hands down. So agriculture is a huge one. And then it sits on a whole bunch of rare earth minerals that is a $1 trillion industry. And the absence of war, a peace process that allows for the mining of minerals will pay for Afghanistan over and over and over, potentially be able to restore to countries like the United States some of the investments we have made in the country in these last 20 years. So the potential for great wealth is there. There is also the less tangible but still lucrative transit. Afghanistan could be a hub for trade between Central Asia and India through Afghanistan and Pakistan. That will require a great deal of political work. The neighborhood is dicey and relationships are complex for sure. But there are people who are working on that already, and the private sector has a huge interest in seeing a peaceful Afghanistan because it opens up markets and trade routes. And then of course, the thing that has funded so much of what has gone wrong in Afghanistan in the last 2 decades has been opium. And it is just a tragedy, frankly, that, opium doesn't need any water and is easy to grow because that was pretty much all they had. It is also increasingly true of the bush that produces ephedra, as you see methamphetamine production skyrocket. Also a very hardy plant that doesn't require much to yield bad things for the rest of the world. So the counter-narcotics effort is going to be something that doesn't disappear the day after a peace agreement is signed, right? That's a whole different set of, we haven't really talked about the fact that there are competing groups of bad guys in Afghanistan, but there isn't just one. And the sort of criminal enterprise associated with opium production will be something that a post-peace Afghanistan and the international community will have to deal with. The Taliban have made some money from opium production, but of the total pie, that's a relatively small slice. So you have organized crime, you have probably political interests, a whole range of actors who benefit from the opium trade. And we have been working on where the opium problem, the counter narcotics issue fits into a peace process format, because you're going to have to address it as you go along and not just allow it to operate unchecked.
Yeah, that's great insight. And yes, there is some irony in the fact that poppies grow with almost no resources in some of the poorest parts of the world. And then they get shipped to places who pay a fortune for the products on the other end. So Vern and Jason, do you have any follow-up questions to that?
So kind of diverging a little bit, how do you think modern technology in like the 21st century with social media and just other types of technologies, how do you think that's changed, just changed how this forever war has?
It's a great question, because the impact has been huge, and I would say hugely positive. And again, you go back to the year 2000, the late 90s and up until 9/11, Afghanistan was an international pariah. It had no friends, because the Taliban was, trampling on human rights, as I talked about that earlier. It was also, though, a period of time where people got their news in very limited ways, and so it was possible for the isolation to occur, and it cut off not just the Taliban, but every Afghan that wanted to see the Taliban go away. So the lack of access, because social media, because the internet wasn't a thing in the late 90s, the good guys as well as bad guys got cut out of the equation. So fast forward 20 years to now, the Afghans are connected in so many ways that I think it's impossible for them to close themselves off again. Too many have access to the internet. Internet penetration is not what it is in the United States, obviously, for Afghanistan, but still in the major cities where most of the people live, and with a population where I think 65% of the population is under the age of 25. You have an exploding population that knows what the internet is, knows how to use it, uses Facebook primarily, but also looking at other forms of social media, and is learning to speak more languages than Russian. You've got young people, again, starting to make those networks, starting to make connections to outside of government, to their peers and peer groups in the region and elsewhere. And I think this is a force for good. Now, bad guys will use it to recruit, but I think that over, on balance, social media plays an important and incredibly useful role in the country.
Ted, go ahead.
I want to join with that. I think Karen is right on of all the positive aspects of the digital age and whatnot. But as you finished up, Karen, and talk about the bad guys, I think to answer you, Varun, again, in terms of the role of the digital age more broadly, there are groups, and we saw this when ISIS morphed into ISIL, and then now what we find is it's spreading throughout Africa very, very fast. They're using the vehicles of the digital age to propagandize, to recruit, but to convert. And it's a two-edged sword. And as Megan will tell you, that those who work with USIP recognize that we have to counter that. to go back to your first, we hope that the era of big armies is over, of wars like that, and what some of us grew up with, the nuclear umbrella. But we see now that with the use of this technology, people who have grievances, or people who have greed, people who want to propagandize, they can use this. And so we have to be alert that that's a two-edged sword, and be able to counter it, not with more stronger armies, but also with what do we do on social media. It's an excellent point. Thank you.
Excellent. I think it's, I appreciate the question, because I have to tell you, we are in session 8 of this Youth Security Forum, and we have talked about Facebook in all 8 sessions, regardless of the topic, despite the fact that most of the students are not on Facebook here. They all have different other social media communications, but most of the organizations that we were talking about, Facebook had a huge role in. So Karen, as you're looking forward, you mentioned that when the Taliban took control the last time, they were able to basically cut the country off from the world. You can't put that genie back in the bottle, right? You can't just build those and cut everybody off. Social media is out there. There's a large young population. But we also know that the Taliban are not the nicest guys in the block, and they have treated all sorts of populations not very well, and most especially women. You mentioned earlier the issue of education being a factor. What do you see, and I'm not asking a crystal ball, but just from what you've seen as the momentum, what do you see as we pull out between now and 9/11, 2021? What do you anticipate happening, and what will the Taliban look like this go around?
Yeah. So, so one of the things that we have already talked to the Taliban about, and I was an early part of these conversations with them, was some instruction to them about how the world works in 2020, and that Afghanistan is still a country that has changed in many ways, but it is still going to need to be a recipient of international assistance for years to come, as again, institutions and networks are reestablished and the country moves from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. The leaders of the country are not going to be able to do that without significant international assistance. And that international assistance comes with strings. We are not simply going to write a big fat check to the government that may include in a peace settlement members of the Taliban and say, use this money as you see fit, we trust you. The money is and not just the United States, but now I feel fairly confident that I speak for my counterparts in many European and allied countries like Australia, who say the assistance will be predicated on Afghans being able to exercise their full human rights, and that women will be able to have, as it is stipulated in the Afghan constitution, the right to education, the right to economic opportunity, the right to equality. And the Taliban have signaled that they understand the way the world works today. I still need to be convinced, but there is a conversation that is happening that is trying to set some expectations with the Taliban negotiators about how the rest of us operate. And I think one thing that has been frustrating for the Afghans has been our expectations of them that they will represent the entire country in negotiations with the Taliban, right? So and here's what I mean. If we go, the Afghan government, I think, would have been very happy to just have a small government delegation sit down with the Taliban negotiators and talk about the future of the country. But we wanted to make sure, we, the international community, wanted to make sure that the government delegation included more than just a very small set of actors. We wanted to make sure there were women there. We wanted to make sure there were Hazaras there. We wanted to make sure that the demographics of the Afghan negotiation team reflected the entire country, young people as well as more experienced people. We did not demand the same thing of the Taliban negotiators. And the Afghans would often complain to us that we had a different set of expectations for one side and not the other. And that was absolutely true. And I would say to my Afghan counterparts, of course, we always expect more of our friends than we do of our enemies. That's the way the world works. And so the Taliban have had, I think, some exposure to what the new Afghanistan looks like. But I think a big part of the peace process discussions will be exactly figuring out what rights for women, how rights for women are protected, if not expanded as the world goes on, how people will get education and what can be taught. So those are all values that are held very closely by donors, and we will expect to see those values adopted in the next government of Afghanistan, which, as an outcome of a peace process, would include the Taliban as well. But they have some learning to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I appreciate your candor about what the discussions are, and then your level of confidence in those discussions. So I'm going to open it up one last time to Vern and Jason. Do you have any other additional questions before I let Megan give a little bit of insight into USIP programs? Okay, hearing none. Megan, I'm going to let you do it. And then Karen, I'm going to let you close out with your final parting words to the students, to what you think they should be thinking about in their next phase in life and career. Megan.
Thank you, Karen. You're a hard act to follow. Gosh, I'm encouraging all the students watching this to please follow up with the Institute, follow up with our website. I will go ahead and put our website and my email address in the chat box, and please consider me sort of your conduit to anything at USIP. What I'm taking away from this hour, and I'm struck by the title of this idea of Forever Wars, is how important it is to understand the conflict and the complexity of it, because it both gives you a better sense of why these wars, but also why it takes so long to build peace in places, and how important it is to have patience, but also where these opportunities lie for peace building, so that it's not seen as hopeless, but there are these moments, there is change that can be made. And that stands out to me from this conversation. And I hope that students will please go and learn more on our website about Afghanistan, but also about all these other conflicts that you read about in the news that maybe feel impossible or too difficult, because you'll find a lot of great information on our website that help you understand the complexity and help you see those opportunities and those moments for change. So there's great articles, there's great research. If you're doing it for school or just for your own benefit, please do check out our website. If you go to the education and training section, you will find resources just for you. There are student contests we co-sponsor that you can participate in to learn more. If you want to take some action, we offer a Peace Club starter kit, so you could think about what it means to start a Peace Club at your school or university as you move on from high school. There are great online courses you can take for free to really dig deeply into this content and these skills so that you're developing the skills of conflict management and peace building. And so there's lots of great ways to stay engaged with us. And we hope that you will continue to think of us as a resource and reach out to us for any connections in any ways we can support you. So thank you to the students, and thank you, of course, to Maureen and the NSF team for having us.
Excellent. Thank you, Megan. Karen, your last word. You get the last word.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you for getting us through today and helping me think about my thoughts by giving me such good questions and topics to talk about it. You've done a terrific job. It's been great to be your partner. And to the students, this is going to be your world. It doesn't matter what you do in life. I think increasingly, partly as a result of technology, but as we evolve, it's going to be impossible to do things without others. That's where I start, right? I come back to where I started. You don't have to be a Foreign Service officer like me to do that. Megan's talked to you a lot about what organizations like USIP do, and do please go to the Global Academy. I have taken some of their online classes. They're terrific. But if you are interested in government, there's the State Department, but there's also a Foreign Agricultural Service with USDA. There's a Foreign Commercial Service with the Department of Commerce. There's if you're of a more technical mind, the U.S. Agency for International Development works pretty much in every service industry you could imagine, from IT to agriculture. But if you're interested in foreign policy and the State Department, then you can go to careers.state.gov and look at everything from internships for high school students all the way up through postgraduate opportunities as a way to kind of test out whether the State Department is a good fit for you. I think citizen diplomacy is highly underutilized and something we need to do. We, the government, needs to do more with we, the people, kind of a thing. But government's not for everyone. Public service is hard on families. In my business, we move every 2 to 3 years, and that can be hard on kids. That can be hard on spouses. So it's not for everyone, and that's okay. There is a civil service side of the State Department that works, that is based in the United States, that still contributes importantly to foreign policy decisions that the government makes. You can be a businessman and be involved in international relations. I think there's really no career that doesn't have an aspect to it that can expose you to foreign countries and foreign cultures. So I would say, don't decide now what you need to be, but take a look at everything. And the internet here is a powerful tool in terms of finding government and non-government opportunities to contribute. I promise you, you will be involved in some sort of there will be some international dimension to your life. I am fairly confident. So good luck to you. It's an interesting world out there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Karen, for your service to the country and for your participation in this event. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Ted, for your sponsorship, and our NSF colleagues, and to all the students. We wish you well, and please stay in touch with national security issues in the future. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.